All right. So thanks a lot. Thanks for coming despite all the competing events and slapstick going on. Thanks to Florian for inviting me, and thanks for everybody coming out. So as Florian said, I am going to be talking about some work that is from and related to the current book project, which I'm just about to wrap up. I mean, I finished writing it. I just need to finish putting some images together, really. So I'm really excited to do that here also. So I mean, I'm going to be here for the next 3 weeks, and that is my major project, is just to wrap that all up. So the official title of the talk, as you know, is Images of Discorrelation, but I added a subtitle, Screen Time. I thought a lot about what I should present, and I could have gone in different directions. I hope I chose the right one. So this one is going to be about temporality. What I'm going to be presenting is all very much work in progress. I mean, it's kind of wrapped up for the moment, but it's not wrapped up for good. So I am really looking forward to any feedback that you have about it. And I'm going to start by, first of all, can everybody hear me well? Okay, good. So I'm going to start by giving you a kind of brief introduction to the project as a whole, to the book project as a whole. And then I'm going to focus on one of the core kind of media philosophical interventions of the book, or at least the first steps of a media philosophical intervention, namely a rethinking of the temporal phenomenology of digital images. And this is where the unofficial title comes in, Screen Time. But first, the overview. Discorrelated Images explores the transitional space-time between cinema and post-cinema. More precisely, it probes the transformational temporal and spatial articulations of contemporary moving images and our perceptual, actional, and affective interfaces with them as they migrate from conventional forms of cinema and enter the computational systems that now encompass virtually every aspect of audiovisual mediation. While the generation, composition, distribution, and playback of images increasingly become a matter of algorithms, software, networks, and codecs, our sensory ratios, as McLu called them, are being reordered. Our perceptual faculties are being reformed or reformed in accordance with the new speeds and scales of imaging processes. In a post-cinematic media regime, that is, both the subjects and the objects of perception are radically transformed. Older relations, such as that between a human subject and a photographically fixed object, are dissolving, and new relations are being forged in the microtemporal intervals of algorithmic processing. With the new objects of computational images emerge new subjectivities, new affects, and uncertain potentials for perception and action. At the heart of these transformations lie the generative dynamics of high-speed, or often real-time, in quotation marks, feedback and feed-forward processes, which introduce and modulate new contingencies at the heart of post-cinematic mediation. We glimpse such processes in digital glitches, for example, which derail perception and inject the microtemporal misfirings of the computer into our subjective awareness. The underlying contingencies, however, are beyond the purview of subjective perception. The algorithms and hardware operations responsible for the glitch are fundamentally discorrelated from phenomenological processes of noetic intentionality. Moreover, the glitch reveals a more general instability attaching to computationally mediated images, which are highly volatile and always in danger of dissolution. Processed on the fly in an interval that is inaccessible to human perception, the images that populate our world are themselves discorrelated from human subjectivity. Nevertheless, various forms and manifestations of contemporary audiovisual media mediate to us these processes, providing sensory complements to subperceptual events, helping us in a sense to negotiate the transition to a truly post-human or post-perceptual media regime. These mediations and negotiations are the core focus of the book project. So discorrelated images engages, in other words, with the transactions between human and machinic agencies as they together broker the ongoing transition from cinematic to post-cinematic media. Framed as such, the project has to answer a number of objections at the outset. For example, isn't the death of cinema a tired cliche? Yes, I think so. And isn't therefore the very notion of post-cinema superfluous? No, I don't think so. So the machinery of cinema has changed, to be sure, but the cinema thrives even in a computerized world. Indeed, there's no hard break, no bright line between cinema and post-cinema, or what I'm calling post-cinema. The vision of post-cinema that I'm advocating is not predicated on cinema's end, but rather its envelopment within the larger space of an environment that has been thoroughly transformed by the operation of computational processing. There are real continuities between the experience of going to the cinema in the age of celluloid and that of watching movies stored and screened by way of digital apparatuses. We still consume moving images, and these moving images still mediate stories and other recognizably perceptual contents. But in focusing on those continuities, we risk overlooking the volatility or contingency of the correlation between subject and object, which in the age of computational processing teeters precariously atop microtemporal processes that are radically different in speed and scale from human perception. The perceptual correlation, in other words, pertains to a level of phenomenal experience that is abstracted from and systematically blind to the underlying discorrelation. And yet, I argue, the underlying discorrelation transforms our experience in important and far-reaching ways. Some of these effects are more readily apparent, like the sensation of being blown away by the ostentatious display of new visual effects, or simply taking notice of, perhaps slightly annoyed by, formal changes introduced through nonlinear editing and digital color grading. Other experiential effects are less obvious. For example, the subtle confusion between diegetic and extradiegetic spaces introduced through a digitally simulated lens flare, which at once simulates the physics of an analog camera that asks merely to be looked through in order that we may perceive the simulated reality beyond, while also embracing the goal of ostentatious display, begging to be looked at for its stunning simulation of reality, right down to the interplay of light and a non-existent lens. Phenomena of this sort refuse easy resolution. In oscillating between invisibility and display, or between the subjective and objective poles of experience, the virtual camera defies traditional phenomenological analysis. The CGI lens flare points, therefore, to the discorrelation of perceptual objects from viewing subjects, and thus to the need to locate the experiential impact of contemporary images at a deeper level of affective materiality and embodiment. Digital glitches, lens flares, and other such figures serve as concise emblems of discorrelation. And I read the films and videos and other media, including video games and other things, that employ these devices as parables of the experiential transformations that ensue as a result of our encounters with the underlying processes of computation and its altogether non-human affectivities. And at stake, above all, in these encounters is a radical reorganization of time and our relation to it. So one of the goals of my book is to think carefully and to take seriously the question of what is popularly called screen time. Is this a term that you're familiar with, screen time, as a popular term, like people worried about how much time kids spend on computers and stuff? Okay, so this is what I'm thinking about, but I'm trying to rethink what that means. So how concretely is time modulated in post-cinema? In order to think through the issues involved in this question, we need to consider the connections and, above all, the temporal interchanges between the technical substrates and the aesthetic forms of discorrelated images. As I argue in the longer chapter from which the following is taken, at stake in these interchanges, or in the temporalities that emerge in the process of formation and deformation of images from their contemporary substrates, is nothing less than the time of human life itself, the modulation and transformation of inner sense or self-affection in Kant's terminology, or of internal time consciousness, as Husserl puts it, in a post-cinematic world. So the term screen time calls to mind attempts by parents to regulate their children's use of screen-based media, especially mobile devices such as smartphones and tablets. The term has recently been appropriated by Apple, whose screen time function, introduced in 2018 as part of their mobile operating system iOS 12, allows users to monitor and limit access to apps during certain times of day or after a given period of use. As Apple puts it, quote, "Screen time lets you know how much time you and your kids spend on apps, websites, and more. This way, you can make more informed decisions about how you use your devices and set limits if you'd like to." Thanks, Apple. All right, so clearly this system of automated reports, restrictions, and time-based access is right at home in what Deleuze has called the control society. And while the notion of screen time and its regulation via screen time seems to concern rather gross temporalities and hence the structuration of time on the part of fully formed subjects or individuals rather than the individuals that Deleuze wrote about, sort of anticipating the role of big data in our world today. So even though it seems to pertain to fully formed subjects or individuals, the worries that motivate efforts to limit screen time implicitly acknowledge a radically transformative impact on subjects. Screen images in direct relation to the time that they occupy our experience can shape who we are, for example, warping our subjectivities by implicating us in addictive behaviors. This at least seems to be the worry. Screen time thus links the power of images as an explicitly temporal force with the ethical field of education in the sense of Bildung, or the formation of the subject. Seen in this way, struggles and concerns over screen time situate subjectivity as a contingent and moldable formation that emerges from the temporal exchanges of computational substrates and image forms. Significantly, this implicit view converges with Niklas Luhmann's view of the child as the medium of education, according to which the object of education, the formation of the child's subjectivity, is precisely the modulation of what he calls the operative deployment of the difference of medial substrate and form. Screen time, in other words, coincides in important ways with the temporalization of experience that gives shape to who one eventually becomes. By invoking the concept of screen time, I wish not only to foreground the ethical stakes of post-cinematic images, but also to gesture towards the futural dimension involved in them, their role in shaping future subjects and future experiences. As we'll see, it's precisely the operationalization of this futural or predictive orientation that most centrally distinguishes post-cinematic images from cinematic ones. In this respect, post-cinematic media conform to Lev Manovich's claim made, 20 years ago, about what he called, at that time, new media, which people still talk about sometimes and other people don't, and its difference from older or what he called modern media. So he wrote, "New media follows or actually runs ahead of a quite different logic of post-industrial society, that of individual customization rather than mass standardization." This notion of customization, like related terms such as personalization, is clearly relevant to the discussion of control. And it's this dimension of new media that has often been heralded in more utopian views, namely that new media, especially following the advent of Web 2.0, provide people with content that is tailored to their interests, more relevant to them, and that therefore enhances individuality rather than enforcing the standardization of taste and experience, as was the case, supposedly, under the more limited mass media. The flip side, however, is the legitimate concern that personalization is really a process of shaping the person, a fear that is implicit, as we've seen in discussions of screen time, and that is in fact supported by a systems theoretical view of education or of subjects' relations to the temporalities of substrate form interchanges more generally. In any case, Manovich's statement connects these concerns with an interesting temporal claim, that new media actually runs ahead of, as he puts it, the logic of personalization that it seems to follow. It's especially this anticipatory dimension, closely linked to the temporal dynamics of subjectivation, that I'd like to pursue here and to connect explicitly to the screen phenomena of digital images. My means of approach will be by way of narrowing in from larger to smaller temporal scales, from the relatively long circuits of prediction and anticipation at work in personalized video platforms like Netflix, to increasingly shorter circuits involved in lower level operations of streaming, buffering, compression, and real-time processing. Connecting these technical processes with aesthetic forms that problematize the various temporal scales, we'll see how images today anticipate the subjects who perceive them, how our screen time is an emphatically ecstatic time in which we become who we will have been. So, customized futures. How do discorrelated images actually run ahead of, as Manovich puts it, their would-be or will-be perceivers? And how does this futurity work concretely to shape the subject of perception? In an article titled "Catered to Your Future Self, Netflix's Predictive Personalization and the Mathematization of Taste," Netta Alexander addresses this imbrication of predictive futurity and the customization of perceptual experience in terms of Netflix's algorithmic recommendation system. As she shows, the system enlists data mining and statistical analysis in order to effect a, quote, commodification of the eye, effectively the control of experience, in such a way that subjects the aesthetic category of taste to a sort of digital automation that would surely make Kant roll over in his grave. Instantiating the broader, what she calls shift from a mass economy into a niche market of personalized services, Netflix's recommendations feature, the recommendations feature pretends to learn one's preferences based on viewing habits and to suggest content that one might like to see, magically reading our minds, in effect, to help us discover content that perfectly suits our taste. In fact, however, these suggestions are normalized in several respects. Because of the company's commercial interest in maintaining viewers' engagement, to start with, there's a prioritization of content that is more or less likely to please, which means in practice a prioritization of mainstream successes at the expense of more marginal content. And even more significantly, the viewing subject to whom Netflix's recommendations are addressed is hardly identical with you or me, but instead involves what Alexander calls a collective personalization, a process whereby my viewing behavior is aggregated together with that of others in order to predict what I might like. Thus, far from reading my mind, Netflix's recommendation system is very much involved in a standardization of taste and in the formation of the anonymous sort of industrialized collectivity that Sartre refers to as seriality. To the extent that I come to identify with the recommendations, and hence to the extent that my taste coincides with that of the anonymous collective of individualized viewers also caught in the feedback loops of Netflix's algorithms, then to that extent I will have been anticipated and indeed shaped by the recommendation system. Far from neutral with respect to the identity of viewing subjects, this algorithmic taste machine is in fact complicit in the generation of the future subject. It's clear from the foregoing that the temporal circuit involved in this sort of taste-making futurity is situated within a relatively long window of time, as it involves an analysis of present and past viewing behavior, ideally encompassing years of data about my viewing choices, in order to predict and or shape what I'll like in the future. We can begin to see, however, that this temporality might scale to fit into smaller windows. It's useful in this respect to recall that Netflix began as a DVD rental service years before it turned into the streaming platform that we know today. It was in this inherently slower context of delivery by mail that the company developed its proprietary Cinematch algorithms for movie recommendations, which draws on viewers' ratings on a 5-star system in conjunction with an elaborate system of micro tags and alt genres. So the micro tags consist of manually entered metadata. So somebody actually has to enter all this in. It's not AI, right? So manually entered metadata describing each film or TV show according to a plethora of data points. Names of actors, locations, themes, even less obviously quantifiable metadata concerning feelings, narrative form, and qualities like romance or goriness. What Netflix refers to as alt genres, short for alternative genres, are statistically computed categories, at one point 76,897 of them, ranging from scary cult movies from the 1980s to chilling goofy movies to evil kid horror movies that enable a more fine-grained matching of movies to potential viewers or vice versa than more traditional genres like Western, comedy, or science fiction. As we see, these predictions are based crucially in a dividuation of decades worth of media objects by way of microtags and a reconsolidation of them as big data in the form of alt genres. But as long as the unit of exchange was an integral movie, a DVD, transported back and forth via postal delivery, both the viewing data and the feedback loop were relatively crude. The move to streaming in 2007 enabled significant refinements by way of narrowing the temporal window to near real-time feedback about what, when, and how often one engaged with various types of content, as they like to call it, content, right? As Netflix put it in a 2012 blog post, streaming has not only changed the way our members interact with the service, but also the type of data available to use in our algorithms. For DVDs, our goal is to help people fill their queue with titles to receive in the mail over the coming days and weeks. Selection is distant in time from viewing. People select carefully because exchanging a DVD for another takes more than a day, and we get no feedback during viewing. For streaming, members are looking for something great to watch right now. They can sample a few videos before settling on one, they can consume several in one session, and we can observe viewing statistics such as whether a video was watched fully or only partially. Narrowing the window between selection and viewing from distant in time to right now, along with real-time surveillance of browsing and viewing behavior, provides the necessary foundation for zeroing in more closely on the perceptual present, as well as for shifting the futural dimension more explicitly from prediction to generation. So with the help of this finer-grained data, Netflix has moved on, famously, from simply recommending movies and shows to producing its own original content. Famously, the Netflix series House of Cards was generated on the basis of the data that it collected from monitoring the behavior and inferred preferences of millions of streaming subscribers. Thus, while the images streamed when one views the series are of course audiovisual records of the past, right, the pro-filmic events staged and captured by cameras and other recording equipment, they are also in a sense images of the future, a future that was algorithmically calculated and individually imagined before it was made present on viewers' screens. So, streaming in time. Disregarding the predictively generated audiovisual content, the actual sounds, images, and narratives for the moment, the sheer act of streaming implicates as well a finer-grained temporal control process and a more immediate calculation of futurity. The present of experience is more concretely and precariously at stake in this stream of images, which flows from the future and into the past, much like the flow of our own perceptual consciousness. So much depends on this synchronization of the two streams, as becomes suddenly clear when the video stream is disrupted and we are ejected from the ongoing flow. In another article titled Rage Against the Machine, Buffering, Noise, and Perpetual Anxiety in the Age of Connected Viewing, Neta Alexander investigates the ways that this disruption in the form of buffering evokes spectatorial anxieties and new modes and embodied forms of viewing that, though they are central to our experience of contemporary moving images, are too often brushed aside in critical studies and marginalized in both industrial and marketing discourses and viewers' memories alike. Alexander connects this erasure to utopian promises of seamless interaction and the aforementioned predictive personalization. An imagined seamlessness that is based in discourses of abstraction and dematerialization that are at odds with the material realities instantiated in streaming video's technological, economic, perceptual, epistemological, and temporal logics. It's worth expanding briefly on Alexander's diagnosis, which I develop in a somewhat different direction, in order to understand how the temporalization of streaming fits in between the higher order prediction and generation processes that I was talking about a moment ago, and still lower level processes that are underlying these. So the term buffering refers both to the technical operation whereby a portion of the video stream is preloaded in memory in order to ensure uninterrupted playback. But it also refers more colloquially to those moments when the buffer is empty and needs to be reloaded, when the video stops and a spinning circle or similar animated icon appears, perhaps accompanied by the word loading. Recognizing this duality at the heart of buffering is crucial for understanding the triangulation of subjective experience with respect to the temporal interchange between technical substrate and aesthetic form. For it's essentially a technical failure that makes us aware of the process and hence our own involvement in it in the first place. Visibility is therefore the exception, invisibility is the norm, and yet this invisible process is crucial to our subjective enjoyment of the video stream. Like Martin Heidegger discovering that his hammer is broken or missing, we discover the invisible process of buffering when it fails and reveals itself as an obstinate presence at hand. Unlike Heidegger's hammer, however, the normal functioning of the video stream is not quite the readiness to hand of a functioning tool or equipmental object, as the stream's temporality is more actively involved in shaping the temporal flow of our own perceptual consciousness. And it's precisely this, rather than any specific instrumental reference, or the in order to structure, the Struktur of equipment, according to Heidegger, that is revealed by the interruption of the stream. The synchronization of internal and external flow therefore establishes the basis for the marginalization and forgetting of interruption that Alexander identifies, as well as the anxiety over breakdown. The breakdown of the video stream's flow is a malfunction of our own temporal flow, throwing us out of our attentional attunement with the video stream and back upon ourselves. The stakes of buffering are therefore existential, not merely technical. In the conditions that make possible a coincidence and threaten a non-coincidence of buffered video stream and unfolding temporal experience, we discover a mesoscale version of images actually running ahead of perception. The video buffer anticipates our immediate future, a future measured in seconds rather than days or weeks. And much like their pioneering work on the longer range processes of predictive recommendation and content generation, Netflix is again an innovator in the mesoscale field of buffering, an existential innovator in the realm of temporal control. Consider the company's strange test videos that have come to light in recent years. Shows like Example Short 23.976, Example Show, the 4 seasons of the original series Test Patterns, and the remarkable 12-minute movie Meridian. Has anybody seen Meridian? You got to check it out. You got to search for it. They will not recommend it to you. It's a test video, but if you can find it on Netflix, it's well worth your time. Yeah. So such videos are used for real-time testing of bitrate and resolution, or they provide test patterns for identification, as it says here, test patterns for identification of AV sync offset, coarse monitor calibration, surround sound channel identification, device side scaling, and overscan. So with their real-time computational feedback regarding network speed and video quality, presented either in graphical form or as textual output displayed in the top left corner as you can see here, of the screen. Such videos make streaming visible, not only by way of breakage, ideally, but by transforming our view of the stream and establishing what philosopher of technology Don Eide calls a hermeneutic relation to it. The stream continues to function, but we view it through a layer of forensic or diagnostic information about its current state. We read its operation rather than just watching it. Clearly, this mode of viewing, which is meant more for technicians than it is for consumers, is a non-standard form of spectatorship, but it's revealing with respect to the calculation and engineering of experience at stake in buffering. In particular, these videos reveal that what Alexander called the commodification of the eye comprises a much lower level process than is involved in prediction and content generation, and that it involves precise technical measurements that exceed the powers of discrimination of human vision. Of example show, a 2010 video summarized on its Netflix page as an example of a show and starring actor and actress engaged in such activities as running around outside Netflix headquarters, splashing in a fountain, juggling balls, and even doing the moonwalk while working on a laptop, which you'll see in a moment. Netflix communications officer Joris Evers said, "That's primarily a video we use to give ourselves and our partners, a way to test Netflix. Further, we would never put this video in suggestions, and you can only find it by searching on Netflix." Indeed, none of these test videos will be recommended by Netflix algorithms because they are inherently at odds with the type of viewing experience that the company seeks to create, one in which the temporal flows of video and consciousness are symbiotically merged, not as here clinically disentangled to make the stream the quasi-object of hermeneutic regard. Such a form of viewing is reserved for specialists, acting as assistants to or proxies for the computational machines. Oh, what happened here? That's... Uh-huh. All right, so play. I can't end my thing now. Skip slide. Okay, wait.
Kill that outside eggs.
Yeah. Oops, let me get that. All right. So it was about glitches anyway, right? So wait, back to right there. Yeah. And let me fast forward, see if we can get some moonwalking action or something.
You can continue look after.
Yeah. All right, so let me see, where was I? Okay, so such a form of viewing is reserved for specialists acting as assistants to or proxies for the computational machines that have no choice but to regard the stream as the temporal flow of information. Ultimately, these videos are not for our eyes, but they enable us to see the machinic processes involved in preparing video streams more generally for human vision. Example short 23.976. There's the guy moonwalking. Go back. Yeah, okay. It doesn't matter. But so this example short 23.976 superimposes an ongoing readout of bitrate, the amount of information processed over time, measured here in kilobits per second or kbps, and resolution data, the number of horizontal by the number of vertical pixels displayed, such as 320 by 240 or 1920 by 1080, right? So it superimposes that over its video images. The juxtaposition reveals a precarious balancing act. The amount of information transported over the network and decoded as sounds and images fluctuates, and it's actively being modulated in order to accommodate bandwidth issues, and above all, to keep the stream flowing. Watching the stream of images with one eye and the numerical readout with the other, viewers then recognize something that they may have occasionally noticed. A video may start out slightly blurry, but then clear up after several seconds. This is due, as we see with the help of the numerical data, to an automatic reduction of video quality, lower resolution and bitrate, undertaken in an effort to allow the stream to accumulate a sufficient buffer before reverting back to better quality, utilizing a technique known as adaptive bitrate streaming, whereby the playback app or device adjusts in real time to bandwidth and processing capacity and switches between different encodings of the video, which is made available in small sections of several seconds each, typically between 2 and 10 seconds each. So ideally, these modulations, which are taking place constantly when you're watching Netflix, will remain imperceptible. The test video reveals how fluctuations are correlated with more detailed scenes, scenes that are more computationally expensive, meaning that they require more resources of time, bandwidth, and processing power, such as a close-up shot of water splashing in a fountain, creating fast-moving and tiny ripples and bubbles on the glittering surface. The scene itself is relatively uninteresting, certainly devoid of any narrative interest, but it takes on a significance in relation to the stream of numerical data as we watch the drama of network problems, weak Wi-Fi signals, and processing bottlenecks being mastered or not in real time, all for the sake of keeping the video stream flowing. What this drama unfolding between the numerical and the figural outputs makes apparent, there it is that human perception and its synchronization with the ongoing temporal flow of video images is situated right at the intersection of the informatic substrate and the computed visual form. In this relatively small-scale temporal circuit, which depends crucially on the futural operation of the buffer, the time of human perception is immediately subject to dividuation, modulation, and control. The temporalization of substrate form relations, the translation of data measured temporally in thousands of bits per second into visual images computed as an array of pixels updating at frequencies such as 23.976 or 59.940 frames per second, quite literally dictates the temporal flow of consciousness. Until, that is, the stream breaks and the video has to buffer again. There is, of course, much more to be said about buffering, but I'd like to point to just one further innovation that bears directly on what we might call the ongoing existentialization of streaming in time, or the deep affective attunement with and anxiety over streaming video that depends on the synchronization of perceptual experience with the delicate balance of substrate form relations. In late December 2018, Netflix released Black Mirror Bandersnatch to much fanfare. The feature-length movie is a spin-off from the acclaimed science fiction anthology series Black Mirror, which I'm sure many of you have seen, right, which debuted in 2011 on British television network Channel 4, and beginning with season 3 in 2016, has been owned by Netflix and rebranded a Netflix original series. So with its near-future dystopian visions of a world caught in the darkest of feedback loops with their media technologies, which one can recognize as only slightly hyperbolic extrapolations from tendencies of current social media, surveillance technologies, reality TV, and network politics, among other things, the series has a long-standing investment in fostering an existentialist attitude towards contemporary media techniques. That is, the show thrives on its conjuration of an atmosphere of angst about the communicative and infrastructural transformations of our world, and its extrapolated futures thus reveal our present as a moment of crisis, including in its etymological senses of a turning point in a disease, a moment of judgment, or the contingent juncture where a decision must be made and from whence divergent future paths branch off. Bandersnatch intensifies this media existentialism by involving the spectator directly in the need to choose and to act. It achieves this new level of involvement by means of requiring direct input in an interactive narrative, mandating decisions on the part of the viewer or user, communicated via remote control, that will actively change the course of the story, or to be more precise, that will actually steer it towards one of 5 main endings. Most discussions of the movie, if that's what it is, I don't know if it's rightly called a movie or something else, but most discussions of it understandably focus on this narrative interactivity, either praising its novelty or deflating such claims by reference to a long history of interactive fiction, video games, and electronic literature. In this context, critics also foreground moments of self-reflexivity. Centrally, the protagonist of Bandersnatch realizes that he's being controlled by an outside force, namely the viewer, and the movie incessantly breaks the proverbial fourth wall. The viewer is even presented with the option at one point to inform the protagonist that we are watching him on Netflix, inviting the viewer literally to click on the Netflix logo and prompting the character situated in the pre-streaming world of the 1980s to wonder aloud, why doesn't it play?
What the fuck is Netflix?
That's all it was for. Right.
Seriously, what does that mean?
All right, so certainly these aspects of interactivity and self-reflexivity are crucial to the viewer's involvement in the general existentialism of the program, including the channeling of anxiety into a narrow window of real-time decision-making. So you have 10 seconds to choose between options before the choice is made for you, and a bad decision might prompt an on-screen character to comment with both kind of diegetic and extra-diegetic reference, wrong path. Less often commented upon, however, are the technical challenges presented by interactivity and the consequences that it has for thinking about our attunement to streaming video. Certainly, the general smoothness of interactive experience has garnered some attention. For example, an article in GQ remarks, "The first thing that comes to the fore in Bandersnatch is the seamlessness of the decision system. You're given 10 seconds to make certain binary decisions in certain scenes, and there's no buffering or loading in between." The approving reference to seamlessness here belies an anxiety about buffering, which is thankfully rendered invisibly, though it paradoxically does come to the fore for this author. But the idea that quote, "there's no buffering" only makes sense if we recall the dual sense in which the term is used. Specifically, it refers here to the disruptive moments when we are ejected from the stream so that it can load. But this apparent absence of buffering depends crucially on the efficient operation of buffering in its more technical sense, which is no small feat for a branching narrative. Recall that buffering involves the real-time preloading of audiovisual content into memory, thus anticipating present experience in advance. While this operation is complex enough in the streaming playback of a conventional linear video, the complexity of its execution in a branching narrative is compounded by the fact that the computational system has to accommodate multiple possible futures, again measured in mere seconds, from which the viewer may choose. Our precarious temporal synchronization with the stream is thus complicated by the fact that it is not yet known which future images to make ready for experience until after the viewer has made a choice. It's this dilemma and Netflix's mastery of it that marks the site of Bandersnatch's biggest innovation, in my opinion, which consists not in interactivity per se, but in a new system of multi-threaded buffering. Essentially, two streams are preloaded into memory at once, thus achieving a new level of experiential temporalization, or the calculative anticipation of subjective experience. This innovation, which has been remarked only in passing, has far-reaching consequences not only for streaming in general, which stands to gain from the development of such technologies, but also for the prediction and shaping of future behavior and the generation of content. Real-time interactivity provides Netflix an opportunity to gain data about user preferences at a much more fine-grained level of analysis than is provided by their viewing history and ratings of films and shows as integral units. User choices provide minute feedback on what viewers want to see within a given movie, and this data is sure to be used to generate new content for the future, thus feeding back into the higher order circuits of taste-making futurity that I discussed earlier. At the same time, however, the reliance of interactivity on an underlying dual stream buffering system points to a tightening of the temporal window of screen time in which our images actually run ahead of us and modulate temporal experience. Indeed, there are yet tighter circuits still to consider, including the predictive temporalities of compression algorithms and even lower level computational processes. But perhaps I've already taken enough of your time, which, let's face it, could have been screen time. So, thanks a lot.